The state of Qatar is at the forefront of geopolitical issues both in the region and around the world. How did this country, with a population of 2.5 million people and 300,000 citizens, become such a constant presence at the intersection of world issues? We're here today with Dr. Majed bin Mohammed Al-Ansari, and since 2022, he has been an advisor to Qatari Prime Minister Mohammed bin Abdulrahman bin Jassim Al Thani and the spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry of Qatar. On top of that, he is also a wonderful friend. Dr. Majed, it is fantastic to have you on the Swift Hour.
It's wonderful to be with you, Matthew.
So we're here in London, and I have to say I did love. I don't know if you saw the remarks from Cherie Blair the other night when she said, "If you want to meet an American, you go to New York. If you want to meet the world, go to London." Yeah. But Qatar is at the forefront of and at the intersection of so many different world events, and I've always wanted to ask you this: why is that for a country that is as small as the country is, not it's 300,000 citizens, 2.5 million total population in country, yet you are at the intersection of what's happened in Afghanistan, you are key interlocutors on the Gaza war, Ukraine, Russia, the future of Syria, among other things. You were even quite involved in certain elements of negotiations between the US and Venezuela. You seem to choose to have this role. Why?
Well, as you said, if New York is where you go to meet an American, and London is where you go to meet the world, Qatar is where you come if you want to have dialogue with the world. And this is something that is not new to Qatar. You know, the founder of Qatar, Sheikh Jassim, in his poetry described Qatar as Ka'bat al-Madhum, the Mecca of the oppressed. So it is always part of our DNA, that small but powerful, punching above our weight, ready to stand for justice wherever it might be, ready to stand for peace wherever it might be. If you look at I was just saying this morning, if you look at the British communiques on negotiation in Qatar, they all describe Qatar as tough negotiators, right? Savvy negotiators. At a time when even the state was not established, right? We're talking about the 1800s here. But back then, there was a consciousness of the balance of power internationally and regionally that goes beyond the confines of a small country like Qatar. Fast forward a little bit in 1962, the Evian Accords between the Algerians and the French are signed in the residence of the Qatari emir in Geneva, right? And this is 1962. Again, this is before the country gained full independence and had a foreign policy. If you go a little bit forward and you see the cascade of mediations that started with Yemen, Lebanon, Darfur, Djibouti and Eritrea, and then went into a little bit farther into Afghanistan, into Russia, Ukraine, Venezuela, United States, DRC, and Rwanda. There are always two main drivers behind these initiatives by Qatar. One has to do with the way we identify ourselves. You know, His Highness the Emir, he was asked by a French publication once, how do you describe Qatar? He said, energy provider and peace facilitator, right? So that gives us all a very clear mandate from our leadership. The country is an energy provider, and in providing energy is a deal maker, is a bridge between East and West. You know, our clients are in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas. We have investments in our energy sector that spans from Texas and the Golden Pass and Golden Triangle projects to Africa in countries like Namibia, to Europe, here in the North Sea, for example, in South Hook terminal, to Asia, and where most of our clientele is based. That power, that soft power, hard power that's been developed through the economic means, through the ability to negotiate all these tough deals. Because, with natural gas it's a bit different. You have to negotiate 25-year deals, long-term deals, with partners who are always, skeptical of signing deals for such a long time, but are in need of your product. There's a politics aspect, there's an economic aspect, there's a cultural aspect to these negotiations. The experiences that were built through these models were transformed into the area of peace and peacemaking by being able to be quick, to be agile, to be flexible, to understand the context, to understand the culture, to be open to speaking to anybody, and in creating that peace. And it's not easy to do that when you are a small country, but it's easier to do it when you are a small country. On the other side of it, you're asking why. And it's a legitimate question. We can afford to be a prosperous, quiet country that doesn't have a lot of news-making historic moments that sometimes are very difficult for us to cope with. But the reality of the situation is Qatar is one of the most prosperous countries around the world. When it comes to per capita GDP, we're one of the highest around the world. Right? You've been to Doha, Matthew. You know that the people enjoy a way of life that is not paralleled by any around the world when it comes to prosperity, education, health services, and other things. If you want to protect that, you don't do it by closing your borders. You do it by opening your borders, inviting the world in, going out of these borders, exploring the world, and making sure that international peace and security is your guarantee that my children and their children will live in the same level of prosperity we are living in right now. Conflict doesn't know borders. When there is a conflict in Gaza, it doesn't stop in Gaza. We have seen that, it started there, and now the whole region is engulfed in war. In Europe, it's the same thing with Russia, Ukraine. Conflict is colliding all across the world today. And unless we work actively to keep it at bay, and to make sure that other peoples around the world enjoy the prosperity that Qataris enjoy, we will not be able to preserve our peace and prosperity, which we are living in right now. And finally on that, the reality of the situation when it comes to our role in the world is that you can spin it any way you like. You can pragmatically try to explain why Qatar is doing this. But the fact of the situation is, Qataris are well-intentioned people throughout their history. Our leaders have always believed in the role of Qatar, have always believed in the reputation of Qatar as a trustworthy international partner. And we pride ourselves on that. I personally feel, empowered by the speeches of His Highness, His Excellency the Prime Minister, and others when they describe the role of Qatar. I feel proud of my nation, myself, my leaders, when I go around the world and everything I hear is, Qatar is doing a good job when it comes to peace and prosperity. And it's something that we are not willing to relinquish, and we will not be deterred by, bad publicity here and there and bad apples that try to attack the role that we do. We will continue doing it because we have thick skin. And we know how to deal with it. And we know that the work we did bring people home. Not only, people who are abducted or hostages or prisoners or whatever it is. Even when it comes to education. Children in conflict, 12 million children in conflict through a Qatari initiative called Education Above All, were brought back into education as a result of that initiative. So we pride ourselves in being a force for good, and we will continue doing it as long as we can.
I want to talk a little bit about your career, but before that, are you today doing what you thought you would be doing when you were growing up?
That's a very difficult question. I'm sure it's the same for anybody, Matthew. When you grow up, every 2 seconds you have a dream for what you want to do in the future, right? You see a policeman in the street, you say, I want to be a policeman. You go to school and you have this great teacher who has an impact on your life and you want to be a teacher. My father was in the police, but in the police he was quite a unique case because his calling was juvenile services at the time, which is basically, working with young kids, young offenders. And he spent most of his life working on transforming justice for juvenile offenders into being something that is social, educational, rather than penalizing them for the offenses. I was there, as a kid. He would take me to the juvenile services, and I would see the offenders, getting education, taking courses, playing sports, taking them on field trips. That had an impact on me when it comes to public service. I knew that my father could have been your normal policeman, goes to work every morning, comes in the afternoon. He spent days, morning, afternoon, working with these kids, working with the ecosystem around them, and creating that situation where young offenders who took that wrong step in their life would be put back on the right track as a result. That made me really have a special place in my heart for public service. Now, when I started, I was, somebody who was on a scholarship by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I started working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but then I decided to break away from that and went into academia and do other things. But I think public service was always a central part to what I want to do. And in Qatar, as you said, we're less than 350,000 people. Everybody has to do everything. But if you are called upon, I don't think any Qatari would say no. Any Qatari would refuse public service.
So that sense of public service instilled by your father as a policeman led you to be, really, you're an academic more than anything. You founded the Center for International Policy Research. So how did your transition go from academia, from research, into official diplomatic service? And was that a difficult transition?
So when I first graduated, I studied abroad. I studied in the US and the UK and came back. I had to work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as part of my scholarship contract. I didn't find myself in the bureaucracy. I'm somebody who studied, political science for 4 and 5 years, and then coming back and looking at the bureaucracy of it all, it's a bit disheartening. So I found myself more in working with NGOs. I quit a year later, started working with the biggest charity in the country, and then worked with another NGO, and then moved to the university where I continued my education, pursued my master's and PhD. And I found myself very comfortably in academia. You can say what you like. You're educating young minds. You are writing. You're doing research. You're building knowledge. And you're reflecting on everything that's happening around the world and developing ideas for the future. This is why my focus in the university was on policy. Right, so policy research, which is a bit of a niche for academics. And this is what led me to working then in the Security Academy, as heading the Security Academy, and educating young officers on how they should view the world, and then moving to establishing the Center for International Policy Research, which was, it's a culmination of what I believed in at the time. The thing that we needed, which is you needed an intermediary between, policy and academia. Someone who can translate academic language into policymaking. Somebody who can translate ideas into reality. And the center specifically does that through advancing bilateral relations, through think tank and track two approaches, advancing ideas on humanitarian aid development modalities, and working together with experts and policymakers to develop policy papers and policy events that would, have a lot of initiatives in place right now, including, GCC Nordic track. We have the EU-Iran track. We're working on a track on delivering aid and humanitarian services. These are the kind of things the center does, and it reflects my own personal ideas. I was a columnist for about 15 years. I wrote very openly in the media all of my opinions. And then, you're called upon for public service. And that will transform not only your career, but it will take over your personality. Because as an independent academic, I can afford to be at Concordia, say whatever I believe in, with very little, regard for official positions. And you can be true to yourself as an academic. When you are a public servant, you don't represent yourself. You represent your state, you represent your people, and you represent the interests of your state and your people. And you are confided by that. And personally, I remember the first meeting between me and the Prime Minister when he wanted me to take over this position. He said, Majed, your columnist days are over. You can never write anything. And I requested one thing. I said, just let me keep my think tank. Because I do believe that that's something I can do while respecting my role. And, very graciously, he agreed to that. And this is where I think I was able to find that marriage in my personality between the independent academic that wants to be a free thinker, wants to develop ideas away from, the confines of government and public life, and the public servant who will go on media to reflect an official position, regardless of what he believes. Now, I have never had to go on the media and say something I don't believe in, because I do believe in our foreign policy and our foreign policy position, the principal position we have always done. But obviously, if I had more freedom to say whatever I want, I would be more passionate about a lot of the things I'm saying. I hate it when I have to deflect and give very bureaucratic, long-winded, nothing said answers to journalists' questions. But this is the fact of life in this job. And the other part of what I do when I advise the Prime Minister, I really appreciate the chance to be able to provide my opinion to somebody who is not only a Qatari decision maker, but somebody who is affecting decision making internationally. And I've learned a lot from this experience, and it's a humbling experience when you work with somebody like Sheikh Mohammed and the decision makers in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and beyond, because you realize that all these years of education and being an academic and speaking about political science, the realities on the ground, the depth of information you need, the depth of experience you need, the innovation and the ideas you present is something that is learned on this kind of job. And somebody who spends, like the Prime Minister, who spends 26 hours a day working on Gaza, DRC, Rwanda, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, Ukraine, and be able to juggle all of that, along with running the country, of course, because he's also Prime Minister. It's an experience that tells you that whatever you do and whatever busy life you lead, you are but, a very small portion of what he does in that respect. And it's something I highly respect in all public servants that I've seen around me, and that dedication to something that is bigger than yourself. And it's something that I try to embody in my own career.
But you're in this role, you're of course, prominent advisor to the Prime Minister, but you're also the spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry. Is it sometimes difficult for you when you feel reporting is unfair, reporting is biased, given that you've been on the other side of the table?
Yeah, I was a journalist for a part of my life, and I reported on stories, and I wrote columns, and now I realize that the feeling of responsibility when I was a columnist is quite different than when you are talking as a spokesperson in two respects. One, as journalists, we are chasing the story. We are chasing the headline. And sometimes we lose sight of the bigger, the bigger reality around us, which is that whatever we write, whatever we say has an effect on people's lives. Leaking a story can lead to death of civilians. Inaccurate information can lead to chances for peace going out the window, right? And today in my role, I see that happening every day. I see irresponsible journalism by some that lead to catastrophes on the ground. You wouldn't want to say to any journalist, stop reporting, or just report whatever the government wants you to report, because this would kill off any chance for the people to have that independent channel of information coming to them that helps them make decisions without coercion. But it also says that those who work in journalism, those who work in media, especially now, Matthew, we're not in the gatekeeper model of the past, right? We don't have 4 big mega journalist institutions that control every information you get. Today, individual podcasters are more influential than decades-long news channels and news services or newspapers.
I think they're calling it legacy media these days.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Well, yeah, as somebody who worked in legacy media, I can tell you that this completely different landscape offers 2 potential roads. One is information chaos, where everybody's saying anything, nobody cares about the truth. And we are in the post-truth era where the truth is not really important. The fact is not really important. The important thing is narrative, right? You go on your Twitter feed today or whatever social media account you have, and you're going to see everything that the guys you like are writing about. And you are protected from diversity of opinion, right? Which is something that didn't happen before. I would write a column, and another columnist in the newspaper would contradict me, and the same newspaper, and the reader would read both. Today, the responsibility is much higher on the individual reporter, on the individual journalist, on the individual podcaster, to be truthful, to protect the truth, to be a champion of the truth, in a way that has never been the responsibility of individuals before. Today, an individual reporter can break a story, if it's false, that would just, in minutes, be all around the world. Right? When we were writing our columns, that if like 500 people read my column that week, I'd be, celebrating. Right? Today, you can write a tweet, and that tweet could be carried out throughout the world, and whatever you write in that tweet will become the reality of someone that has nothing to do with you writing it or with receiving it. And for us who work in diplomacy, we always try to control narrative. And as I said, we're in a world where you can't control narrative. But what I try to do every time I go to the podium in my weekly briefing, I try to answer every question I get with the least possible deflection by saying everything that I can say and saying saying something about what I can't say and why I can't say it. I try to be as much as possible, truthful, but also sincere in what I deliver. It doesn't work all the time. I don't succeed all the time in coming across the way I want to come across. Sometimes I fail at, giving the journalists the information that they need or that I should give them. But it's something that I've always believed in because I was on the other side of the equation. And I know how frustrating it is to not be able to get any information from the decision maker, not be able to get any information from the official lines, and then be blamed when I write something that is not true. And this is why I really respect engagement with the media, engagement with think tankers, engagement with academics. And this is why when we travel the world, I try as much as possible to have as much media engagement as I can. But we are too few for the stories we break.
Talk about? I've got two more questions for you. Talk about. You have a front row seat to so many of these different world events taking place. Talk about what you think is potentially a positive of this era we're living in. I feel like there's so much focus on the negative, and certainly that is what's reported on more than anything else, and I imagine that's how it's supposed to be, right? Give us the positive that you see consistently in your day-to-day work and travels.
I grew up in a world where most of the world was seen as passive when it comes to international peace and security. We were all, in the Middle East and the Global South in general, on the receiving end of conflict. Conflict was created by greater powers than us, were managed by greater powers, and conflicts ended because the greater powers wanted it ended. Today, take a look at Russia-Ukraine. Who are the mediators who are working on that right now? It's Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Look at Hamas, Israel. It's Qatar, Egypt, and the US. You look at Venezuela, US. It's Qatar. Our part of the world has developed an agency that was not something that we even imagined could happen in the near future. I remember as a kid there was always this kind of populist idea that a phone call from Washington, D.C. would change whatever happens in the Middle East. Today, people are not looking for that phone call. They're making the phone call. Right? And you can see our leaders, becoming more influential in decision-making internationally. You can see our economy develop beyond that point. And I think internationally that's a very important point because, it's a cliche to say that we're moving into a multipolar world. Right? We're moving into chaos. We're moving into a situation where the smoke-filled room of decision-makers internationally is no longer there. So what happens to the people who are, who used to wait for decisions to come from that room? Well, most of them have taken it upon themselves and have developed the agency needed to fill that void. So I think that's a major positive in our world today.
A wonderful answer to that. It's not something, frankly, that I had really thought that much about. Eh, Tell us about a situation, a crisis, or a challenge, a problem that you see around the world that you think is not being reported on today. Something that is getting far less attention than it should.
You know, Matthew, I mean, I don't have to tell you this, but the bandwidth for conflict internationally is just, it's very dangerous. Uh, the lack of bandwidth. If you look, even as individuals, we're forgetting about crises that are raging on across the world. You know, in Sudan, in Yemen, the situation in Libya, only to quote once in the region. But if you go beyond that, Myanmar, you know, uh, everything that's happening around the world is keeping us busy, and the attention span of the world is quite limited, and we care about something for a couple of minutes, and then the new big thing starts, and we start caring about that, and we forget about populations, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are left to their own devices in conflicts that would break any society. The thing that makes me really afraid for the future is the fact that there's a generation growing up in large parts of the world that has no hope in a better future, has no trust in the institution, and has very little respect for the international order. I can see this generation growing up, looking at pictures coming in from Gaza, from Ukraine, looking at this, you know, layered cake of conflict that just keeps on growing, looking into incapacitated international institutions that are unable to solve conflict, seeing the human suffering of millions upon millions upon millions, seeing displaced people being displaced once, twice, thrice, and you know, across the borders, because they are basically running away from conflict that keeps getting to them. And in that, there's a brewing stew of radicalization that's engulfing our world today. If you look today at the situation in Gaza and the effects it had on all around the world, it's not only in the Arab and Muslim world. You know, we see radicalized individuals and a culture of despair that is hitting a young generation. You know, when you're young, everything is black and white, right? When we were young, solutions to world issues are very easy. Right? There's a clear bad guy, clear good guy. When you grow up, the gray becomes the dominant color of how you see the world, and good and bad, you know, become kind of muddled. But for these young people today, do they have the chance to think in black and white like we did? Do they have the chance to identify good and bad? Do they have the chance to at least believe in international peace and security as a concept? Think of a child who's been displaced in the Ukraine or in Gaza, who saw most of their families being murdered and killed off during the war, who saw the dehumanization of his people, who was out of education, out of a job, out of any chance for any kind of future. Think of that child, that teenager, 10, 15 years later, with this, in the same situation, with no solution. How do you think the raising of their children is going to be? What world will they bring their children to? You know, today we heard about the problem of, you know, we don't have enough children around the world, right? The childbearing is at a minimum. And one of the reasons behind that is this culture of despair. And the only way to deal with it is the message of hope. And hope cannot be rhetoric. Hope is not something you stand on a podium and deliver a very heartily felt speech on. Hope is something tangible that you give to someone in their own hand by telling them your children's lives will be better than yours. All of us want that for our children. I don't want my children to live in a world worse than mine. But the fact of the situation is that for this generation coming up now, in most parts of this world, they are not seeing it as a possibility that their children that these children would be brought up in a situation that's better than the situation their fathers grew up in.
Well, Dr. Majed, spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry of the State of Qatar and an advisor to the Prime Minister, thank you very, very much for being a part of the Swift Hour.
Thank you very much for having me, my friend.